So back in 1988, when I was just 18, I was slinging boxes at a warehouse for minimum wage. I had no plans for college, no plans to do just about anything, really. Until one day, this good old boy rolls up in this shiny red Kenworth. And he seemed like a character, so we got to talking, and that's how I found out that he made 4 times what I did just for driving a big rig across the country. And I remember looking at my busted up sneakers and thinking, hell, I could do that. So I took all the money I'd saved up to buy a car and I used it to get my CDL instead. Which, for those of you who don't know, is a commercial driver's license which you need to operate trucks, buses, or anything that transports hazardous materials. And about a month later, I was driving over to my first job interview, and I've been trucking ever since, coming up on damn near 40 years now. And like any job, trucking's got its ups and downs. When the freight's rolling, the money's great, and if you run hard and stay mostly legal, you can clear 6 figures a year no problem at all. Dispatch might decide the destination, but once the key's in the ignition, it's just you, the CB, and 36 tons of steel and rubber. I've seen the whole country on somebody else's dime, and as long as the load's on time and you ain't tearing up equipment, there ain't nobody breathing down your neck. Only trouble is, those damned air ride seats still feel like concrete when you're sitting on them for 10 to 12 hours a day. And then forget about things like Thanksgiving because you're eating your turkey and yams out of a Tupperware container on the side of the I-80. But if you ask me, the worst part of the job isn't the fuel prices, the insurance, or the shippers and receivers that treat you like something stuck to the bottom of the shoe. It's not even the lumpy bunks, the truck stop slop, or the showers that look like a damn crime scene. Those you can get used to. The worst thing about the job is ironically the very same thing that sometimes is the best thing about the job, and that's the people you meet while out on the road. 6 years into my career, I was hammered down and eastbound on the I-80 somewhere just west of Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, it was around 2 in the morning and it was just me and my engine doing about 68 while she sang that old Detroit song of hers. My CB was quieter than a church mouse, and the only thing breaking the silence was the wind whistling over my cab. And then suddenly, out of the dark, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving on the shoulder. I slowed the rig a little and flipped my high beam down, and then there she was, a girl of no more than about 19 or 20 years old wearing a thin white sundress. Her hair's all wild and she ain't got nothing but sandals on by the looks of things, and she's sticking her thumb out, trying her damnedest to get me to notice her. Now, I've heard every scary story from here to Reno about picking up hitchhikers. The ones about scamming lot lizards, the ones about nutcases or robbers, even the old vanishing girl spooky story that every trucker must have heard 100 times by now. Usually I'd have just kept on driving. Ain't my circus, ain't my monkey, as they say. But like I said, something about the way she looked had me easing that 389 Peterbilt over onto the shoulder. And I set the parking brakes, hopped out of my cab, and then started walking back slow so I didn't spook her. And when I was close enough, I called out to her, asking if she wanted to ride. And she just nodded, and then came bounding down the shoulder toward me. Now up close, the backpack that she was wearing made her look even younger. I noticed the mascara streaks down her cheeks and the little bruises on her arms like somebody grabbed her a little too hard. And when she got close, she thanked me with a very shaky voice and then walked around the passenger side and helped herself into the cab. Now, after I got us rolling again, the girl stayed silent in the passenger seat for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I told her that whatever ran her out there in the middle of the night was none of my business. But whatever it was, she didn't have to worry about it in the cab of my truck. She told me her name was Riley and thanked me for giving her a ride. I told her it was no problem, that I'd like to think someone would do the same if that was my daughter out there at the side of the highway. When she told me I sounded like a good dad, but that she never got to know hers, I just apologized. I didn't ask any questions, I just said the world can be a cruel place for good folks, and I was sorry her old man wasn't around for her to know. Now, I didn't know what kind of reaction I was expecting, but I sure as heck didn't expect the girl to laugh. But that's what she did. She suddenly let out this loud burst of hyena's laughter at what was supposed to be a heartfelt consolation. She'd been so quiet that the sudden outburst kind of shocked me a little, and then I stayed shocked when she told me her father was just a sperm donor, her words, not mine, and that he'd done her a favor staying out of her life. Now, I'm no shrinking violet, so I'll admit to letting out a bit of a laugh of my own upon hearing that donor line of hers. I figured that in a get tough or die sort of world, this young lady had simply gotten tough. But there was more to it than that, much more to it. I tried to change the subject away from family and ended up asking her where she was headed and if she was in school. She gave cagey answers to both and then decided to ask some questions of her own. Now, I was open and honest with her, told her where I was headed and what I was hauling. She asked what it was like being a trucker, if I slept in my truck, and if I ever got spooked staying up overnight in some shady truck stop. But then, Riley asked if I was married. It wasn't suggestive at all, just curiosity. But once again, I told her the truth and said that I'd been divorced for coming up on 5 years by that point. I put it down to how young she was, having not learned all her social graces yet. But she did not avoid the topic. Instead, she asked, "Did you love her?" And I nodded but stayed quiet, a hint that it wasn't exactly my favorite topic for small talk, and that's when Riley asked, "Did you hit her?" Now, put it down to some fatherly instinct, but my reaction as that little doozy of a question was way different than if a grown man had asked me that question. I didn't yell, I just simply told her no, and then figured the reason that she asked was because she'd seen her own father do the same thing. Riley replied that I didn't look like the type, and then there was a brief silence before she asked if I had any kids. I said yes, that I still considered myself a father, but the daughter that I shared with my ex-wife passed on about 10 years before when she was just 18. Now, I figured Riley wouldn't exactly treat the subject delicately, but I also figured maybe that was just her way. And so when she asked me, "Did you touch her?" I almost slammed on the brakes. I said I wasn't sure where she'd come from or what her story was, and neither was it any of my business, but I also advised her that questions like that, especially when asked of perfect strangers, would only invite trouble on herself. And her face turned very sad, and then she stayed quiet for a minute, almost like a scolded little girl. And I felt really uneasy, but more at the question of what in the Sam hell happened to this girl that made her so comfortable asking questions like that. Now, I stayed quiet myself, letting that question bounce around my brain as the answers got scarier and scarier. And then finally, Riley spoke again. She turned her head and with this sort of sly look on her face said, "Come on, you never once found yourself looking at her? Felt your eyes wander?" I wouldn't say I exploded, and again, it was pure paternal instinct which kept me from kicking her out of my cab. But from there on out, it was no more Mr. Nice Trucker. I asked her what in God's name was wrong with her, and told her that wasn't my kind of humor, and said if she made any more jokes like that, she'd be back on the side of the highway sticking her thumb out again. She didn't pull the scolded little girl act again. Instead, she let out another one of those hyena laughs before sighing like it was the funniest thing in the world. She told me to lighten up, that she was just kidding, and she was sadly wrong to think a road-hard trucker like me could take a goddamn joke. I told her I could take them just fine, but there were some things you just didn't joke about, and she'd do well to learn that before she pissed me off. Now, I thought that might at least silence her for a while, but instead, Riley started asking me stuff like, "Oh yeah? What's wrong, trucker? Gonna do me, huh?" And then putting on this little girl voice to ask the same question, "What's a big old trucker gonna do to a little girl like me?" Now, I finally yelled at her to shut up. If it wasn't so cold outside, I'd have kicked her out of there while we were driving. But it only took a minute of silence before she said, "I meant what I said. You don't look like the type to hit a woman." Now, I guess that lowered my blood pressure a little because I didn't feel like slamming my foot on the brake anymore. But then she hit me with, "But you do look like the type to F your daughter, pervert." Well, I just about blew a goddamned gasket. I didn't actually slam on the brakes. You can't do that in a big rig without risking some serious damage to your coupler. But I did slow us down and bring us over to the shoulder, and then once we were there, I started yelling at Riley to get the hell out of my truck. I had a snub-nosed .38 in my glove box, but this girl was tiny, so the idea of reaching for it never even entered my head. But it should have. Because just as I unbuckled my belt and opened my door, saying that I was going to drag her the hell out of the cab if she didn't climb out herself, Riley pulled a gun on me. She pulled it out of her backpack when I opened up my door and put a foot on the step. Now 1 second she was empty-handed, and the next, there it was. It looked small, like a .22 or something, but she had the drop on me, so it didn't matter how small it was. The lack of recoil on that thing meant that she could pull the trigger as often as she wanted, and the lack of recoil on it meant that it'd be a goddamn miracle if any bullet missed me. She told me to sit my ass back down in the seat and close the door. And I just briefly considered lunging for my glove compartments and hoping for the best, but I also realized that one shot to the head and it was probably game over. Now this wasn't checkers anymore. It wasn't a case of just getting that bitch out of my cab. We were playing chess now, and I had no choice but to play a long game. After climbing back into my seat, we got back on the road again. Only this time I was driving much slower because if anything happened and we went off the road, I didn't want to be driving so fast that the cab burst into flames. When I asked how far she was going, Riley, which most likely was not her real name, told me to shut up and keep driving. And this was just my anger talking, and I know that I've been better off keeping my damn mouth shut, but something slipped out anyways when I asked her, "Do you even know how to use that thing?" She told me of course she did, that her daddy taught her to shoot so she could keep herself safe from perverts like me. Again, this was her choice of words, not mine. And believe me, she wasn't saying it because of some scar that she'd had deep down. She was saying it to taunt me, nothing more, and I could hear it in her voice. When it came to knowing how to use that pistol, Riley said that I could ask the man who tried taking her to his hotel room back in Denver, who also believed she wasn't capable of using it. But the girl was also quick to add that I'd have a pretty tough time talking to him since she left him lying on the floor of that hotel room, dead as a doornail. And I noticed that she said that about her father, and since I couldn't resist, I called her out on it. I reminded her how she told me that she didn't know her father, and in response, she gave me another one of those hyena laughs. She told me I was a dumb mother effer for believing such a sob story, and that I shouldn't be so gullible in the future. I remember how she smiled when she asked if I believed her about killing a man back in Denver. I told her I'd be a fool to believe anything that came out of her mouth by that point, and once again she laughed. She said she figured I might say something like that, so she brought something along with her from Denver to prove she wasn't lying. She asked if I wanted to see, and with both hands on the wheel, I told her I didn't think I had much choice in the matter. The girl laughed, and then reached into her backpack again and pulled out a Tupperware container filled with what, at first, appeared to be mud. And when she cracked the lid and the smell hit my nose, I knew it wasn't mud. It was some type of congealed blood, and whatever was floating in it was starting to turn. At first, when the girl told me to look at what was inside, I ignored her and kept my eyes on the road. But this only made her angry. She pointed the gun at arm's length, dramatically like, so I could see it clearly, and then she said that she didn't give a good goddamn if it made us crash, because she'd scramble my brains if I didn't do as I was told, and look. Now, I can't express how certain I was when she said that she was serious. I mean, this girl sounded unhinged, truly unhinged, like her sanity was holding on by just a few thin threads. I've had a gun pointed at me maybe a half dozen times in my life, but I only twice truly believed that the person would pull the trigger. Once, I was being robbed by a meth head that I described as barely human, and the other time was in the cab of my truck with that girl, who wasn't named Riley. And so, since I believed wholeheartedly that she was crazy enough to risk her own life by shooting the driver of the big rig she was sitting in, I looked at what was in that container. And when I did, I almost puked. Floating in what looked like dark red jelly were two meatball-sized oval-shaped organs made of a much paler flesh. I knew what they were from the first second I looked at them, and as I stared at them for that brief moment, the smell of them turning hit my nose, and I almost lost my stomach there. I turned my eyes back to the road and kept one hand on the wheel, but I had to cover my mouth and nose with the other as I gagged to keep myself from throwing up. The girl thought that was the funniest thing she'd seen so far, and she cackled like a witch as I coughed and retched. She told me not to worry, because she cut them off of the guy in Denver after he was dead, and not before, so I wouldn't have to worry too much when it happened to me, too. And that was the most terrified I'd ever been in my life, without a shadow of a doubt, and I'm not ashamed to admit it either. I knew that the girl had lied to me once before, and just for kicks, but the evidence of what she'd done was right there in front of my face. At least, I thought it was. Because when I asked Riley if those things in the container really were what I thought they were, she started laughing again. She said they were pig testicles, and I was a coward and an idiot for thinking that they were anything else. I knew better than to say anything by that point, and I just kept on driving. And thankfully, we didn't have to go much further before the girl demanded that I pull over at an upcoming truck stop. I did as she asked, watched as she pulled her gun closer to her chest so anyone outside couldn't see it. And then before she got out, she gave me some big speech about how she normally killed a man before leaving, so they wouldn't come after her once she got out. But in her mind, I was the exception. She said that she knew I wouldn't come after her, and that I wouldn't try to hurt her either. She figured I had a gun somewhere in the cab, and she was right, but she also knew that I wouldn't use it on a girl who reminded me of the daughter I'd lost. No matter how much I hated her, no matter how much I wanted to make her pay for being such a goddamn demon, she knew I wouldn't take away her chance to live, not without feeling like the same kind of evil that had taken my own daughter away. And the worst thing, she was right. Even after she climbed out of the cab and went walking off to find her next plaything, I couldn't bring myself to do anything but drive off, praying that she'd find her way and make a decent life for herself after, whatever it was that she'd endured. I only came out from under that spell once I was about 30 miles down the highway, and I decided the only thing to do was report her to the cops. I ended up stopping at a diner and calling in the whole thing to the local sheriff's department, and they gave me a reference number that I could use when calling them back in the future, but after calling maybe half a dozen times, I heard that there was never any progress and they didn't find the girl. I still hope she found a way to get better. I don't believe anyone is born evil, but a part of me thinks that if that girl pushed her luck a little too far one day, that she might not even be around anymore, let alone getting better. I think my first 6 months of trucking must have aged me by about 5 years, and for the first 2, I felt like I was in pure survival mode. Everything I was taught in CDL school seemed like it was written by someone who sat behind a desk, not a wheel. And no matter how many pamphlets you read or video seminars you watch, nothing prepares you for backing up a 53-foot trailer in a truck stop fuel island at 2 a.m. and with 4 other drivers waiting behind you. I must have burned through 100 gallons of gas just practicing backing up in empty lots, ideally at night too, when nobody could see me sweat. And although I've obviously gotten better over the years, I still get tight in the chest whenever I see a truck parking in rear on a receiver that looks a little too tight. Needless to say, the learning curve was brutal. And in my 3rd week, I forgot to crank my landing gear all the way up, which cost me a damaged trailer and an $800 deductible. And I also learned really quick that the whole 11-hour driving limit isn't a suggestion. I remember I hit 10:59 one night and I thought that I could push for another 45 minutes or so to get home. Maybe 20 minutes later, I literally started seeing the reflectors on the white line start dancing in front of me. I ended up pulling over into a Walmart parking lot where I slept like the dead for 8 hours solid. Long-haul trucking is 20% learning to drive the truck and 80% learning how to live in it. It was a real grind, and then for around 4 or 5 months in, things started to click. I got my sleep schedule down with a 5-hour split and a 6-hour bunk nap that actually worked for me. And then after a while, things like chaining up in the snow or dealing with four-wheelers who think the left lane is their own birthright started to become second nature to me. It was humbling, exhausting, but honestly kind of addicting once I realized that I was actually getting good at something that scared the hell out of you in week 1. And I remember being on one particular run and thinking to myself, yeah, this is the life for me. But it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows, and back in those early days, I made a couple of seriously grave mistakes, and one of them almost cost me my life. And so one morning, I'm cruising through Oregon just after crossing the Idaho state line on the 84, and it's one of those gray Pacific Northwest days. I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's me, my radio, and a flask full of Go Juice. It's all quiet on either side of me, and then suddenly, I see a truck of some kind zooming up the highway behind me. Now, as it got closer, I realized that it was a blacked-out Chevy pickup with tinted windows and no markings, and it was flying up my driver's side so fast that I might as well have been parked. Now, I remember thinking, who the hell is this asshole? But no sooner had that question entered my head, my rear view lit up like the 4th of July. The driver of the black Chevy had placed a set of red and blue LEDs on the top of his truck, and the moment I saw them, my heart jumped straight up into my throat. Unmarked units freak me out, man, and they still do. So as those lights are strobing so hard it looks like a damn rave was popping off in my mirrors, I flicked on my four-ways and then slowed as I tried to find a spot that isn't a 6-inch shoulder with a guardrail. After my tires hit the rumble strips, I threw on the parking brakes and then sat there with my hands at 10 and 2 like I was taught. You don't reach for crap when you're getting pulled over in a rig because cops do not like that height difference. Anyway, the truck's driver hops out and he's wearing a full tactical vest and pistol belt. He's got no state police hat, just a badge attached to the same belt as his holster, but I couldn't make out any details on it. And as he came walking up to my driver's side like he owned the highway, I was running every possible thing I could have done wrong in my head. Be it my logbook, my lights, my plates, my overweight, or my IFTA sticker. I rolled my window down slow as the guy got closer, and then stopped, and peeked around my cab for a second before he spoke like he was looking for Escobar hiding in my bunk. I wished him a good evening, even called him officer, and then when he asked for my license, registration, logbook, and medical card, I handed them over. Now, I waited a couple of seconds as he looked them over and then asked who he was with. And without even looking up at me, he just simply replied, "State," and then kept on looking over my stuff. Now, he looked for no more than maybe 10 to 20 seconds, but it felt like much longer. Now, meanwhile, I'm just sitting there with my hands at 10 and 2, hoping he's just going to tell me that I got a faulty taillight or something and then send me on my way. But then instead, he told me to step out of the cab because he wanted to see what was inside my trailer. Now, my stomach just about dropped straight through the frame rail when he said it, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I was still so terrified of making a mistake and losing the respect of my boss and my fellow truck drivers. And after putting on my high-vis and climbing out of my cab, I walked around to the back with the guy in his black uniform, and he tells me to break the seal and open her up, both doors too, because he wants to, quote, see all the way up the nose. And all the words and terms he used, they made me think that he had a lot of experience, so even though I didn't recognize the badge on his belt and didn't have any name tags or an insignia on his shirt or vest, I just sort of went with it. I pulled my Gerber and cut through the plastic bolt seal, number 78291K, I still remember it, and then dropped it into my pocket like I'd been taught. I swung open the right door first and then the left, making sure to latch them both back. And the whole time the guy was watching me, arms crossed, cold as ice. I wasn't 100% sure what the load was, I just knew that it was written in as sporting goods, but that's not what a cop would have been interested in. Not unless they got a tip that we were moving drugs or something. Now instead, I figured he just wanted to check my pallets, make sure that they're floor-loaded, tight, no more than 3 tiers high, etc. Some cops get antsy about voids either, as in like small spaces between your pallets. But this guy didn't strike me as a regular traffic cop, and neither did he seem interested in the spaces between the pallets. I told him my bills were clean, that there was no hazmat inside, and nothing which required temp control either. But he didn't say a single word in reply. Instead, he just kept on checking what I was carrying, until he suddenly started poking his lights between pallets, kicking straps, and checking for false walls. I figured it was useless to ask the guy what he was looking for, so I just sort of stood there watching him as he took one last look in the scuff. And after that, he came walking back toward me before hopping out of the truck and looking like it was something he'd done 1,000 times before. I asked the guy if I was good to close the trailer over again, but I knew that he wouldn't leave just yet because I needed the paperwork to explain why the seal was broken. But then instead of answering my question, he asked if I got the truck's keys on me. I told him no, that they were in the cab, but the guy told me to stay where I was and that I needed to hang tight for him. And it was only then that I started to get frustrated, but I didn't get mad. I just asked him what was going on. But once again, the guy ignored my question, and then he raised 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a loud, ear-piercing whistle. This is the part where I started to get really confused, not to mention nervous too, because the second the guy whistled all loud like that, maybe 12 to 15 of his buddies appeared from the nearby tree line and then came running towards the truck. I panicked, and my first thought was to run for the cab, but as I started to back up away from him, the guy pulled the pistol from his holster and told me not to move. All I could do was freeze at the sight of the gun and raise my hands in this sort of don't shoot me kind of way. I didn't have the right certification to drive long haul with a gun, so I kind of just screwed up either way, so like I said, all I did was freeze up. And the only thing that got me moving again was when the guy told me to get on my knees. And since I really didn't like the idea of that, I told him no, while I just kept on backing up towards my door. Now I'm proud of myself for that little piece of defiance, no matter how brief it was, but it didn't last. And after the guy cocked that pistol back, had it ready to fire, and gave me the order a second time, it was like my knees involuntarily buckled underneath me. I didn't want to comply, but I also knew it was my best shot at staying alive. If I ran, I had maybe 20% chance of getting away. But lunge at the guy and try to be a hero, then I was a dead man. So I kneeled, put my hands behind my head like he asked, and then watched as he took a few careful steps towards me and put his pistol right up to my forehead. Now call me dumb all you want, I know I was, but it was only then that things really clicked for me. Not even the biggest a-holes among the state troopers or feds would be dumb enough to put a gun to a man's head, let alone an innocent trucker. Whoever these guys were, they weren't police, and I very much doubted that they worked for the government. Saying that, I couldn't rule it out entirely, not in the moment. And that's what pushed me to ask him, "Who the hell are you guys?" And as you can probably guess, he didn't answer my question. Instead, he did that same thing of asking one of his own. And with that gun pushed right up against my forehead, the guy asked if I was an American. And then when I told him yeah, he told me, not just a citizen, and then asked if I was a real American. I didn't know exactly what he meant by that, because what the hell does a real American even mean? But all the same, I told him I was born and raised in New Jersey, so yes, I was a real American. And there was a moment after that where I was kind of thinking, is this guy from immigration or something? What the hell is this? But then, just from the look on his face, I knew this was almost personal for him. He didn't look at all that satisfied with my answer, and then after asking my name, he asked me, "Are you a Jew?" Now, I'm not Jewish, and although my dad was also born and raised in New Jersey, his parents are both from Turkey, and I inherited some of their darker features. And that actually wasn't the first time that I'd been asked if I was Jewish, but the first time, I just calmly explained that no, my dad was Turkish Muslim. But obviously, given the implication of the guy's question, I knew it was not a good idea to tell him that. And so instead, I thought on my feet and told him my dad was Greek. Greek Christian, too, just because I figured that that was what he wanted to hear. But again, he didn't seem entirely satisfied with that answer. Now, it looked like he was thinking for a second, and then he nodded and gave me the closest thing I got to an explanation. He said since I was a real American, I should be happy that he and his buddies were getting their hands on the contents of my truck. He told me to be a good little citizen and reported exactly what had happened so I wouldn't lose my job. But he also said that I could be happy that the goods were going to a very worthy cause, and that what might hurt me in the short term, and very superficially at that, would benefit me a whole lot in the long term. And while he's saying all of that to me, his buddies, who were also wearing all black military gear and a lot of face masks too, were busy unloading my truck. And I later found out that the sporting goods that I was trucking were more like a home defense haul, because it consisted of a lot of ammunition, a ton of MREs, and even things like bulletproof vests too. It wasn't all stuff like that. There were a lot of blaze orange hunting clothing in there too, but those boys in black seemed to know exactly which pallets they were supposed to be looking for, and once they had as much as they could carry, they hauled ass back in the direction of the tree line carrying 2 or 3 boxes apiece. The guy in front of me, who was just wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, kept that gun on me until all of his buddies were out of sight. And then he asked me something which had my heart pounding in my chest. He asked me if he needed to shoot me, because if I was going to go rushing back to my cab once he turned his back to grab a gun and try to be a hero, then he'd just blow me away right there and then and save us both the blood and ammo. I told him I didn't have one, which, like I already said, was the God's honest truth. And he just laughed as he put his own gun away and told me that I should really see about getting something to protect myself with. Then after telling me to stay on my knees till he'd driven off, the guy walked back to his truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and took off down the highway in that blacked-out Chevy of his. Procedure stated that I was to inform the cops of any kind of robbery as soon as I was physically able to. And so, that's the first thing I did. I then called my route manager from the same payphone to let him know that I'd be delivering late and light. And he actually laughed as he told me that I was the first truck to be robbed in just over 20 years. The only one driving for our company, at least. I know he was only laughing because I was okay, and that only the trailer had been stolen, not the semi itself. Now, I'd be lying if I didn't feel a sort of rush from it too, having gone from thinking that I was going to die to smoking a cigarette at the side of the highway and making jokes with the cops photographing the open doors of my trailer. I was later told that the people who robbed me were most likely members of what the cops called the Silent Brotherhood, some militia-type group who were based in the Pacific Northwest. They went on to do a bunch of other stuff like that, robbing and killing, and I always felt very lucky that I got to walk away, and I didn't end up like that radio DJ guy that they ended up murdering just a couple of years later. I heard the FBI ended up bringing the Silent Brotherhood down, but I also know that there were many more militias out there. Maybe not all of them are the DJ murdering, trailer robbing kind, but just them existing is enough to give me the willies. In my 25 years as a long-haul trucker, I've been to some incredible places, and I've met some incredible people, too. It never ceases to amaze me how kind, compassionate, and downright wholesome folks can be to one another and to me. But it also never ceases to amaze me just how damned creepy some folks can be, too, and it stands to reason that it's always the ones you least expect. Many years ago, I was driving a big rig through Colorado snowdrifts, and on this leg of the journey, I was somewhere between Denver and Aspen, and it must have been close to 1 o'clock in the morning. Driving an 18-wheeler at night is one thing, but driving through snowy mountains at night is another thing entirely. Accounting for wind chill, outside temperatures reaching -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and then while it's snowing, all your high beams do is create a wall of bouncing light that can cause some really nasty headaches. And all your road markings, reflectors, and shoulders just vanish under the drifting snow, and then there are patches of black ice that you don't know are even there till it's way too late to do anything about it. Mirrors turn to useless bricks of snow. Gas gelling can cause a whole bunch of engine problems, then hit the brakes in the wrong way, and you can jackknife an 80,000-pound piece of hardware. Needless to say, it can be really tough on a man's nerves, especially if he doesn't have much experience out there on the road. And that's exactly what kind of situation I was in, when something just about scared me half to death. So, I was rolling down I-70 and I just passed Wheeler Junction headed westbound when out of nowhere, this little pink blur stepped out in front of me from the snowbank on my right. It was like time slowed down for a second. I knew it was a little girl. I knew the only thing that I could do to save her life was slam on my brakes, and that's what I did. The Jake brake screamed, and the trailer groaned as my ABS, the anti-lock braking system, hammered like a machine gun. I yanked the wheel to the left, trying to put the whole damned rig into the oncoming lane because the right side was nothing but guardrail and what looked like a 500-foot drop on the other side. Snow was flying up the tires, chains were rattling like they were fixing to shatter, and there I am, praying harder than I ever did in church that this trailer doesn't jack and take that little girl with it. She looks up at me with these big eyes, frozen like a deer while it still feels like time is dragging, and I remember the split second where I thought, oh God, this is it. I'm going to be the guy on the news who flattened a kid on a mountain highway and die myself. And the rig slowed, and somehow the good Lord gave me just enough room because I ended up missing the girl by no more than the width of a Bible, I'd say. I slid past, doing maybe 15 with the trailer fishtailing, and while I'm sliding, I catch a glimpse of the girl in the mirror. She just stood there, having not moved a muscle while the snow swirlies danced around her. I got my rig stopped maybe 100 yards down when it finally came to a halt. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. I looked out into my side mirror, which I could now see out of thanks to all the snow having been shaken from it, and there she was, still standing there, looking like she was half frozen already. I set the brakes and turned on my four ways so that people could see my lights before they saw my truck, then hopped out into the powdered snow piled up on the shoulder. The wind was cutting through my jacket as I sort of went back up the hill, back when the little girl came into view again, and I called out to ask if she was okay and where her mama was. But all she did was look at me with those big eyes, all quiet, and then when I saw how blue her lips were, I walked over and scooped her up. She was as light as a sack feather and she didn't even fight. She just buried her face in my jacket as I hustled her back to my truck. I climbed in, pulled the door shut, and then, after sitting her on the passenger seat, I cranked the heat to a Mexican wedding, as they say, and then grabbed my old Carhartt coat and wrapped her up like a burrito. She didn't talk for maybe a good 10 minutes. She just sat there, all bundled up with her teeth chattering so hard that I thought that she might hurt herself. I poured a little bit of coffee from my flask into a cup, and she managed a few sips and then just curled up and stared at my dash lights like they were hypnotizing her. I eased us back on the road, very gentle-like and keeping it under 30, and then as the heaters were roaring, the colors started creeping back into her cheeks, but she still didn't talk until we were maybe 10 miles down the hill, and when she did, it was like crawlers creeping over my skin. Because all she said was, "He's gonna get me." I asked, "Who's gonna get you, sweetie? Who are you talking about?" But the cold must have had her head all scattered because all she said again was, "He's gonna get me. Please don't let him get me." I asked her again who was going to get her, and then after thinking for a minute, she told me she didn't know his name, just that he was going to get her. I told her she didn't have to worry, because there was no way anyone was going to get her out of my damn truck, but not without a damn good fight anyway. And that seemed to calm her down a little. And then when I told her I was going to get her back to her mommy, I saw her smile for the first time. And then maybe a minute later she said, "You better go quick. The man who's going to get me can run really fast." I told her not as fast as my truck, thinking it would reassure her, but she responded right away with, "Nuh-uh. He can run even faster than a truck." I told her I doubted that very much and that she didn't need to worry. That didn't seem to satisfy her, but she stayed quiet as she screwed up her face like she was thinking something that she didn't know how to put into words. And a few minutes later, after realizing that I hadn't asked her yet, I asked the girl if she knew where she lived. She said she was from some place near Denver, some kind of suburb, but I can't remember the name. And then when I asked how she ended up in the snow, she explained that she escaped from the man who was keeping her. and it was like talking about him jogged her memory because she immediately began telling me to drive faster because if I didn't, the man who'd kept her was going to catch up to us. Now once again, I'm telling her, that's not going to happen, kiddo. Ain't nobody driving this thing off the road. But she shook her head and told me, he doesn't need to drive faster. He can fly. And at first, hearing her say that just kind of made me sad. Some sick monster had obviously tried to scare her into obedience by telling her all sorts of crap about him being able to run really fast or even fly. But then, as I wondered what kind of freak would do something like that, just picturing some creep running as fast as my truck or flying through the night sky before landing on my cab, it just about creeped the hell out of me. And I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me want to drive a little faster, even though I knew damn well that what she was saying was impossible. Now, it didn't help that I asked her if she would tell me anything about the man who'd taken her. And we'd already established that she'd been taken from the parking lot of a grocery store because she mentioned something about shopping with Mommy, and then the next thing that the man was holding her hand and telling her that they were going to find her mom. Obviously, that was a lie because she hadn't seen her mom since. But when I asked her for some specifics about him, what he looked like or what kind of house he lived in, all she said was that he lived out in the woods and he looked, in her words, real scary. Now, I know it might sound dumb because this was a kid saying it in some scared little girl voice, but when she said he looked real scary, it sent an actual shudder through me. I guess it tapped into my own long-lost sense of childlike imagination, and I guess it figured that some freak who'd abduct a kid would be real scary looking, but just the thought alone scared me. I then asked the girl if she could tell me anything about where she was kept, and when she said no, that it was always dark and she could never see anything, I just figured I better stop asking. I was taking her to the cops, who'd no doubt ask her a ton of their own questions, and I doubted I was helping any by making her talk about it. But I also had this terrible fear that for some reason she might not survive till we got to the cops. My sister is a nurse, and the thing she told me about kids that really stresses her out is how they hang on and hang on and hang on, then bang, they just slip away on you real fast. The girl was talking, and she looked way better than she did out on the highway, but there was a part of me that thought, what if she doesn't make it? And not just because of the hypothermia that she might have suffered, but because the person chasing her might still have caught up with us at that point. And I knew well enough no man could fly, and that no one could run as fast as a truck either, but he could most likely drive, and if he wanted to keep his ass out of prison, he'd be on the road behind us looking for that girl. And that was my thought process at the time anyways, and as you can imagine, I was creeped the hell out on top of everything the girl had said. But no one caught up with us. The girl made it to the county sheriff's office in a place called Vale, and that, boys and girls, is where we parted ways. Now, I still think about that little girl sometimes, though. She'll be a woman by now, maybe even with kids of her own, and while I have no doubt that she remembers the trucker who pulled her out of that snow and stopped her freezing to death, I hope to God that I get to meet her again one day, so I can find out why she was out there in the first place. Now, I didn't read anything in the local newspaper about it. No reporters came knocking on my door to take a statement, and no cops either, so I don't know if they ever caught that scary-looking guy. I'm just hoping that that little girl is reunited with her mama, and that she grew up to be happy, in spite of whatever she'd endured. I used to work at this trucking company out in California. Not 18-wheelers though, just regular 4-wheelers that had cold storage in the back. I worked there for 4 years, never once took a day off for any reason, and that was partly down to liking my own coworkers so much. Now, for the most part, the other drivers were a great bunch of guys. Management was another thing entirely, but all the guys down on my level were great workers, and I'm proud to still be able to call some of them friends. But then, about 5 or 6 months before I quit in protest, they hired a guy named Jerry. Jerry seemed like an okay guy at first. A little quiet maybe, but he delivered on time and he didn't have any problems with anybody. But then came what I now consider my first clue to there being something off about Jerry, and That's when Tony tried showing him a picture of his niece. She just started elementary school, and Tony's getting all teary-eyed, saying look how fast they grow up, and passing around his phone to people to show them pictures of her. But when he tries showing Jerry, Jerry just gives him this icy cold, no thank you, and then just carries on with his business. Now, Tony was really offended, actually, and he was joking when he said, "What's that asshole's problem?" But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Even the guys who clearly didn't give a crap about Tony's niece at least took a look and said something like, she's cute, I'm happy for you. But there was Jerry acting all awkward like we were trying to show him a booby magazine or something. And like I said, I guess that was my first real clue right there. Everyone else figured that that was just him. Quiet, verging on antisocial Jerry. And after a couple of months, it just drifted into the background and slipped from my mind. It only came back a few months later when I was driving back to the depot that I spotted one of our trucks parked near an elementary school, just not in the parking lot. I slowed a little, hoping to spot one of my coworkers so I could honk my horn at them, but when I did, I didn't honk. It was Jerry, and that's when I realized why his truck wasn't in the parking lot. He wasn't making a delivery. He was just standing there, watching the kids play in the yard. Now I'm thinking, what is he doing? But I didn't stop, not that first time. I figured he probably had a kid at that school, or that maybe he just delivered there and was taking a smoke break or something. But like I said, the truck wasn't in the school's lot, and I didn't remember Jerry ever smoking back at the depot. Now, this was weird, but I wasn't Jerry's boss. And I'm also not so much of an a-hole that I'd try and act like Jerry's boss. And if he wanted to goof off or do some family stuff on company time, that was his problem, not mine, and I didn't mention it to him either. But then, not even a week later, I spotted him doing the exact same thing on my day off. I was driving by the exact same school when I spotted one of our trucks in the exact same place that had been the previous week. It was like deja vu. The school, the truck, and then Jerry, right there in the same spot. That time, I had a sort of double moment of what the F, because what was he doing there a second time? But then as I slowed and watched him in my side mirror, I could have sworn that he was holding his phone up against his chest, in a way a person might do if they were secretly recording. Now, I guess I am kind of an a-hole to risk ruining a working relationship over a suspicion as weird as that. And if it turned out he was holding his phone, then whatever, I'm the a-hole. But if he was out there recording those kids, that was something that I wasn't going to tolerate. Now, I'll admit to feeling kind of crazy as I walked up to him because after parking my car and getting out, I didn't so much as walk up as sneak up. But then there he was, holding his phone maybe 6 inches from his chest, and its screen was all lit up with what was clearly a recording of the schoolyard in front of him. And I said, "Jerry, what the hell are you doing, man?" And obviously, because he hadn't seen me, he just about jumped out of his skin before locking his phone and sliding it into his pocket. Now, he told me in that very quiet, weird voice of his, "Just taking a break, man." But I knew what I saw. And when I demanded that he show me his iPhone gallery there to prove that he hadn't been doing what I thought he was doing, he refused. Now, I was causing such a ruckus that some of the kids and one of the teachers started to pay attention to me yelling, and when Jerry realized that we had an audience now, he hopped back into his truck and just drove off with me still yelling at him. I remember calling a couple of the guys that night who told me that I should do the right thing and tell our supervisor what I saw, and so I called him and gave him the full story too. Everyone was being very understanding and saying stuff like, "What the hell? That's messed up. He's doing that on the job? To get him fired." And the same was true with my supervisor, who said that he'd bring it up with management and work that slacking off on the job angle so they could actually fire the guy. My supervisor did have kind of a warning for me though, like it wasn't all smooth sailing, because when he asked if I'd taken any pictures of Jerry and I said no, he said, "Dude, really would have helped if you did, but now it's just your word against his." Now, I figured that might be an issue, but like I said earlier, I put more than 3.5 years into that company, and I busted my butt every single day I was on the job, too. I figured that might count for something, but it didn't. and it didn't count for a goddamn thing. I had 3 days off and I spotted Jerry on the second one, so it wasn't until a day after that I was back at work again. Now, I figured I might even stroll in to see no sign of Jerry, with his locker having been emptied. But Jerry was still there, and I barely even clocked in before my supervisor said management wanted to talk to me. I knew it must have been about Jerry. There was nothing else that I was expecting it to be about, and I was right. But what I figured would be little more than a recap of my story turned out to be anything but. I was in there for like half an hour, and a lot of crap got said, but the gist of it was this. It wasn't Jerry that was in the wrong for taking pictures of kids. It was me, because I was harassing him. Okay, so management didn't exactly say that he wasn't in the wrong taking those pictures. They just didn't see it that way at all. Based on what they'd been told by Jerry, he had an interest in photography, and when I decided to violently accost him, he was standing nowhere near the elementary school in question, and neither was he facing it. Jerry claimed that I'd taken a dislike for him ever since he started, and what I was doing was nothing but an attempt to get him fired and force him out. I told management that was a lie and that me and all the other guys have been nothing but all right with him, and I also offered to get pictures of him doing his thing, just like my supervisor suggested I do, but they told me if I did, I'd be fired. Now, I say the meeting was with management, and it was more like between me and the HR guy that had been hired around the same time Jerry was. He was the one laying down the law and saying that I'd be fired if I carried on harassing Jerry, and he did it all while looking and talking at me like I was some brainless idiot. Now, I told him just because he had a college degree didn't mean that he could talk to me like that, at which point the big boss stepped in and told me to calm down. He was a good guy, so I did like he asked, but that didn't mean that I was going to take it. Since I was being treated like a nobody and management was sticking by HR and siding with that pervert Jerry, I quit that same day. I gave my 2 weeks and I wasn't about to leave anyone in there, but I didn't want to have to work a single second more than I needed to at a company that had hired that goddamn chomo. And no one liked what was happening, but this HR guy was from corporate and they could hire and fire just about anyone they wanted to and often did. That meant that no one wanted to stick their head out above the clouds, so to speak. Now, I might have quit, but I kept in touch with the guys, and I've stayed friends with a few of them even all these years later. And that's why, maybe even 7 or 8 months later, I was one of the first people to hear when Jerry got arrested at work. He was a part of some FBI sting involving online child predators, as in like he thought he was talking to a 13-year-old girl when really it was some FBI agent in his 30s. And well, when I found that out, I drove straight over to that old job and almost got myself arrested when I demanded to talk to the HR guy that almost fired me for pointing out who Jerry really was. I know that was a jerk move, and I ended up apologizing to my old boss on the phone later that evening. Boy, was I fuming. And I'm actually glad that the HR guy wasn't there that day and that I didn't catch him going to his car, because I really would have ended up in jail for beating his ass. Now, the guy never showed up for work again either. My old buddy said that he quit the same day the cops showed up at work to arrest Jerry, and even though he left stuff in his desk and he didn't pick up his phone whenever they tried to call. I guess he figured that they were as mad as I was, and in one case they were. But all management wanted to do was return his stuff and do a brief exit interview over the phone, but still he didn't pick up. If there's 2 things that the whole thing taught me, it's this. Always trust your gut, and HR people are a pain in the goddamn neck. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured in the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Check it out, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Merry Christmas.